So, Will McMorran, thanks very much for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
We are going to be discussing a man who, maybe wrongly, maybe correctly, doesn't really need an introduction. He is a cultural name that we unconsciously or maybe consciously know if people are into radical literature. That is one Marquis de Sade, author of 120 Days of Sodom, Marquis de Gang, which are the two that you have translated, Justine, Philosophy in the Bedroom, and then beyond that, you might wonder why anyone's kept going deeper into de Sade. Maybe they're really into him. But yeah, but equally, de Sade has found a place in philosophers such as Deleuze, Bataille, many others, notably in French philosophy. And so we're going to be, discussing Sade, hopefully a bit of his life, his work, of course, his philosophy. But you are, as we were talking before we started, one of the few de Sade scholars. So please tell us a little bit about yourself. And I guess, dare I say, what it is that drew you to spend however many years now with de Sade as company.
It's been a lot of years, and it was by accident, really. So I was doing my doctorate in Oxford, 25 years ago or more, and I was replacing a colleague on leave, and he gave me a list of books that I could teach some students on 18th century libertine fiction. And it was kind of the classics like Dangerous Liaisons, things like that, really good stuff that I had read. But there was this one book that I hadn't read, and that was Justine, which is a novel by Sade. And so being a typical doctoral student, I only started reading it the night before I had to teach it. And then I spent the night thinking, how on earth am I going to teach this? Mm-hmm. And it sort of gets worse. I could only do it out of complete naivety, really, because in Oxford at the time, you didn't get a teaching room to teach students, and it's a tutorial system. So an unlucky student, had to come to my sort of college room and be taught Sade. And it's just, I look back and cringe in horror, but it was fine because I was so sort of naive about it, and so was she, I think. So I did what most Sade critics would do in the circumstances, which I skipped over all the rude bits, and I talked about the philosophy because that was where I felt I was on safer ground. Yeah. But that experience stuck with me. And in a way, sort of 25 years later, that question about how on earth do I teach this has been a kind of driving question. And the other question is really a question that comes from my experience of reading Justine that first time, because I think I was a sheltered reader. I'd never read anything quite like it. And I just kept thinking, is this okay? Is this okay? And so that experience of reading Sade and then having to teach it was really kind of pivotal for me. And I've been trying to kind of come to terms with that experience of reading Sade ever since. Anyway, it sort of opens out to broader questions, which were from my kind of research, which is really a question about the power of fiction. There was a time where we thought literature was morally improving, and that it was good. It was a sort of civilizing force, and it brings out the best of humanity and all that kind of thing. But Sade is the sort of dark side of all those questions. Some books can be good for you. That opens the door to some books being bad for you. So it's sort of opened up questions to me about whether what we read, and by extension what we see in the cinema or on the internet, whether that can do us harm. Can we be changed by what we encounter? So it opens up to questions, that go back into the 1980s and 90s, the anxiety about pornography, which is still with us. And, our susceptibility to all sorts of forms of fiction, whether it's advertising, pornography, propaganda, all those kinds of things.
So when you talk about the experience of teaching it, you mean the experience of sort of almost having to deal with stuff that is, let's say, beyond just intellectual. It's going to be emotionally and sort of qualitatively uncomfortable experience. It's going to be an experience.
Yeah, so in a way, it's that hour tutorial went okay, but I felt I was dodging all the interesting and challenging stuff. So I started thinking about, well, how could I teach this? You know, how can you teach Sade to groups of students, you know, as a feminist? Is there a kind of way to do that as a male teacher of largely female students as well? That, you know, which how it is in the humanities. You know, there's all sorts of power dynamics and gender dynamics that you have to consider. So in a way, I was drawn to just the difficulty of it. I wanted to find a way to teach this kind of material and see if I could do it. So it was kind of a challenge. And so I've been after finishing my doctorate, I got a job at Queen Mary in London, and they allowed me to teach whatever I want. So I've had no kind of interference. And so it's allowed me to kind of explore that challenge and to sort of learn how to teach, you know, really difficult, kind of misogynistic, violent, sexually violent material to students in a way that I think is useful, because there has to be a point, you know. If you're going to put students through reading that material, which tends to be optional on my modules, you know, I don't make anybody read it. But there has to be a point, so maybe we can talk about that as we go on.
Yeah. Well, when we get to your, you know, the time you spent translating 120 days. So I'm intrigued that after reading Justine for the first time, were you drawn to Sade's, you know, style and work? Did you quickly seek out the rest, or was there sort of time between? If that one, you know, hit you, then there's of course going to be the first time you read 120 days.
Yeah, Justine's the polite one. So yes, I did. So I just, you know, there was just something compelling about Sade, and I think it's because the reading experience is not like any other. And I think one of the reasons why I found Justine so sort of alarming is I'd read novels like that on the surface of like, and Justine's the story of a young girl who's sort of suddenly orphaned, finds herself alone in the city, and goes to various people for help. She goes to a priest first of all, who then makes a pass at her, and then she, you know, and then a series of disasters happen. But that beginning premise is the premise of a whole bunch of 18th century novels of a young virtuous woman in distress. And it's that classic sentimental trope. But in sentimental fiction, somebody comes to their rescue.
Yeah.
You know, and the young woman tells her sob story. She moves her audience to tears, and they look after her. She finds a benefactor or a benefactress. You know, and Justine does all the right things, but it gets the wrong response. So I think what intrigued me and what I found compelling about Sade is that sense of uncertainty when you read any of his books, which is you don't know what his intentions are. You don't trust him. So there's a kind of interesting. We're all used to reading novels with unreliable narrators, but those we can read those because we assume, perhaps naively, that the author behind them is reliable. That when there is an unreliable narrator, we assume it's the narrator that's being unreliable, not the author. We assume that the author behind the narrator has honourable intentions, and that he won't be on the side of the baddies, to put it simply.
Yeah, sorry.
So anyway, so what I think makes Sade unique is that sense that you can't trust the author, that you don't know whose side he's on. And it can be naive to think he's on the side of the goodies, but it can also be a bit presumptuous to think to assume he's on the side of the baddies as well. So there is that sort of sense of uncertainty that I think makes what can often be quite an ordinary story really kind of gripping and unsettling. It's just that unease. There's a sort of unease with Sadean fiction that you don't quite know where he stands, so you don't quite know where you stand.
Well, and this is why I included this question. So, you know, the question I want to ask is there any misrepresentation of Sade you want to counter immediately? And the reason I asked that is because, you know, I had a quick look last night. Actually, I thought, I wonder what YouTube is like for de Sade. And actually, it's mostly AI images of de Sade generated, and it says the title is something like "History's Worst Monster," you know, and then the runtime is 10 minutes, and they're probably going to detail his life. And so, the reason I ask this is because I think there is a current historiography graphical approach in academia. I guess it spawns from postmodernism to not only sort of deconstruct a hero or the good person and go back and say, well, actually, you often see the inverse. So we might go back to people who have become a caricature of the bad and say, well, actually, but it seems with Sade pretty watertight on his life and what we know, that he was a monster.
Well, I don't know what a monster means. I
That
mean,
seems to be the word everyone was using. That's why I use that word.
no, well, it's the word that everyone was using even in his own lifetime.
Okay.
You know, so, I mean, he has been a monster for much of the last sort of 200 years. But there have been sort of blips in that, and one of those blips was kind of caused by sort of post-structuralism and postmodernism in a way, which sort of defanged him, as some critics have said. But he is a figure that has kind of accumulated a whole sort of collection of myths, and that started, as I say, in his own lifetime. And there's a sort of curious phenomenon by which different generations of readers have seen themselves in Sade and Sade in themselves. That he's kind of a mirror to people. So in the sort of early 20th century, there was a kind of rise of sexual science, and this was generation of sexologists kind of saw Sade as a sexologist. At the same time, the surrealists got very interested in Sade, and they described him as the kind of, the god of surrealism. Later on, some feminists even hailed Sade as a feminist, as unlikely as that may seem. And the sort of same thing happens with kind of structuralists like Roland Barthes, and they sort of see him as a kind of a linguist rather than anything else. So, and the myths begin in his own lifetime because Sade committed some notorious crimes, crimes that attracted celebrity, and not in a good way, in his own lifetime. So he became a scandalous figure in his own lifetime. Those scandals were kind of magnified in the public imagination. So there were particular episodes where what he did hit the 18th century press, and massively amplified on a hugely exaggerated scale. So he became a monster in the public imagination, and this was for what he did, not for what he wrote, because at the time he hadn't written anything. So that's one of the sort of myths about Sade, is that he's kind of imprisoned for his radical writings. He hadn't really written anything by the time. It's prison that makes him a writer. So he's in prison. The reason he spends so much time in prison is because his mother-in-law had enough of him sullying the family name and her family name. So he never faced trial. So he was a victim of injustice in the sense that he never faced a trial and all that. But it's hard to have an awful lot of sympathy for him.
Yeah. So it seems it's a life of, for the first part, it seems a life of finding a woman, basically largely locking them up in a room, whether it's a prostitute or someone he's fallen in love with, abusing them, and then committing acts of pretty full-on blasphemy. And then he in and out of jail about 3 or 4 times. And then there's the sort of, right at the end, there is a madness and a full long-scale locking up in what's more of a mental institute. But because of his aristocracy, he seems to have a fairly easy time of it.
Well, prison wasn't all bad in the 18th century, So, I mean, just give one example: the Bastille, where he ended up at one point. Prisoners in the Bastille would have most of the 18th century, despite its reputation, they'd have visitors. Some of them could even come and go as long as they were back at night. They could have food brought to them, and all sorts. So it wasn't the most, it wasn't the grimmest place you can possibly imagine. But essentially, his sort of misdemeanors and crimes, it started off as a young man. So he, like many sort of aristocrats of his generation, he joined as an officer in the army. He started to gain a reputation for his exploits off the field rather than on the field, and for spending an awful lot of time in brothels. And it got to the point where the commissioner for the police in Paris was warning the mesdames of brothels not to let their girls leave the brothel with him, not to go to sort of other houses with him, uh, and his conduct is shocking for sort of today's audiences, but it was not necessarily out of the ordinary for a young male 18th century aristocrat. So, there are accounts of him taking one sort of sex worker to a little house and committing, as you say, sort of acts of blasphemy, and accompanying those with, he wanted to flog her with a whip, but she didn't want him to, and then he asked her to flog him, Um, but the flogging would not have been a kind of issue for 18th century kind of law or police. It's the acts of blasphemy.
Yeah, he asked her to. Was he asked her to stand on the crucifix and denounce Christ? I think.
He asked her to do imaginable things with a crucifix, which I
Okay,
think.
okay.
Well,
Well, you can imagine that.
Yes, but it's that because it's blasphemy. So obviously, this is a Catholic country, and the Catholic Church has great authority, and so acts of blasphemy are really what get you into trouble. There's not a lot of sympathy for sex workers being beaten up by clients, but blasphemy is kind of a red line. So that's the first time he kind of spends a little bit of time in prison, and there's other episodes, and there's one in Marseille, which is the one that makes him a bit of a celebrity, which is he tries to organize an orgy with four sex workers and his valet, and he gives them an aphrodisiac called Spanish fly coated in chocolate. They eat some of them and then they fall ill. And one of them goes to the police, and it's accidental. And they're all fine. Nobody dies or anything. But when it hits the press, it becomes a story of like an orgy featuring all of the women in the town. And it describes them all as being overwhelmed by a uterine frenzy. So it becomes this kind of huge scale. And that prompts him to escape to Italy. So he flees justice there, and he leaves his poor wife to try and sort it out and smooth things over. And while she is sorting out all of that, he rewards her by going off to Italy with her sister, with whom he has an affair. So I mean, it's quite a life. His life, if you look at the biographies of Sade, they're all about that thick. Because
we know a lot. I mean, he must be a lot of historical detail that's been left.
Yeah, well, there's a lot. There's a paper trail when you're in trouble that many times.
Yeah.
And so I mean, it's an extraordinary life. There's one part. It's got everything you would want from a kind of 18th century romp. There's people firing at him, an angry father of a servant firing at him and narrowly missing his head. He narrowly misses the guillotine during the revolution. Prison escapes, all kinds of stuff. And there's one point where he writes a letter to his wife, having just escaped from prison. He said, "This is just like it's straight out of a novel," and it really is. And then and sort of jumping ahead to the end of his life, he ends up spending the last 10 years of his life in a mental asylum in Charenton, which is kind of represented in the film Quills, if you've seen that. And he's the label that he's given is sort of libertine dementia, which is not a diagnosis. It's not a thing, So really, there is no madness.
Oh, okay.
But it's just, the label becomes the reason, the rationale for locking him away. There are periods in his life in prison where you do think he's flirting with madness. Like, for example, when he's writing the 120 Days, his prison correspondence reveals quite a disturbed mind. And he's kind of tortured by the fact that because there's no trial or anything, he never knows if and when he'll ever leave prison. There's no sentence. So he's constantly looking in letters from his wife for clues as to dates. And he sort of descends into what's been described as sort of number madness. He's looking for codes and numbers in what she's saying. There aren't any. So there is a kind of neurosis that develops out of that, but it never seems to develop into a full-fledged, kind of breakdown.
Do you think that was just because he was locked up? and didn't know when he was going to leave.
I think it was that. I think it was the kind of desperation to leave. I mean, being locked up in a cell 2 meters by 3 meters for a few years doesn't help.
That was the one where he writes 120 days. So it was only 2 by 3.
Well, that's in the Chateau de Vincennes. So he's in there when he's arrested for 4 or 5 years, and then he's moved to the Bastille, where it's probably a larger cell, but it's still, it's damp, it's miserable, it's isolated, and I think it's the uncertainty. Is this going to be forever? Little did he know that the French Revolution was going to come along and save him. But had it not been for that, he probably would have spent the rest of his days in prison.
Okay. So this is sort of where I guess you come in historically, because 120 days is written on a small piece of parchment and rolled up and hidden behind a brick, I believe, in the wall, and then retrieved. And it has that manuscript itself has an extremely long history, which that history almost sort of hasn't ended. If I'm right in thinking, the original manuscript is still sort of a bit tucked away. It's there's a bit of variety around it. Oh, okay.
It's finally found a home.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, the story of the scroll is like a novel in itself. He writes it in 37 days, having taken copious notes beforehand. But the actual writing of it is done in 37 days. He works 3 hours from 7 till 10 in the evening over those 37 days and produces this sort of 180,000 word manuscript. And as you say, so he writes it, he sort of has these exercise books and he tears out the paper and he sort of glues them together to form a scroll. But he doesn't finish it. So this is in 1785. He writes, it's a novel in 4 parts. There's a prologue. It's a bit like the Canterbury Tales. It starts off with this prologue to set it up, and then there's 4 parts. But he only writes out the first part completely. And the final parts 2 to 4 are just left in note form. So they're just sort of lists of what he would have sort of fleshed out. And they effectively read like a kind of list of tortures. But there's something about that experience of reading those, because it's very minimalistic. It's just like one after the other, in very relentless succession. But he chooses not to finish it because this is 1785, and he stays in the Bastille until 1789, but he doesn't touch it again. So there's something interesting about that, and that raises lots of questions about why he wrote it, why he didn't finish it, who did he write it for, as well.
So you mean he wrote up to that point, tucked it away, but was still in the same cell, still in the same prison?
Yeah.
Didn't have anything else to do, did he?
Well, maybe he sort of took it out and read it from time to time. I'm not sure. But it then became the trigger for writing lots of other things. So that it becomes an intensive period of writing. He writes lots of short stories. He writes the first version of Justine called The Misfortunes of Virtue in 1787. He writes a very long novel called Aline and Valcourt, and various other things. But he doesn't go back to it. And effectively what happens is 10 days before the Bastille is stormed in 1789, because he has been causing trouble as usual and sort of shouting out to the crowds outside the Bastille, help, help, they're cutting the throats of all the prisoners. The governor in charge of the prison decides to move him out of the prison to somewhere else. And he does so in the middle of the night, on the 3rd of July, I think it is. And he's sort of grabbed from his cell naked, according to him, ushered into a carriage, and has to leave everything behind in his cell. So that's all of his writings. So as far as he's concerned, the 120 days has gone. Everything else has gone. He begs his wife to go to the prison to collect his belongings, to collect the scroll. And she does so, but she does so on the 14th of July, when all hell is breaking loose, Bastille Day as it now is. And she doesn't get to the prison because at that point they're executing the governor of the prison, the crowds, and they put his sort of head on a pike. And so it's just too dangerous for her to go anywhere near the prison. So Sade weeps tears of blood, as he said, over that loss. But someone does find it. So this guy called Arnold de Saint-Maximin, uh, one of those that storms the prison, grabs the scroll apparently, and somehow it ends up in the hands of an aristocrat from the south of France, and it sort of remains with him and his family for much of the rest of the 19th century. And there are rumors about it. People hear tell of it. There's a famous collector of pornography called Henry Ashby in the sort of latter part of the 19th century, who provides a very sort of few lines of it in his sort of index of forbidden books. But it basically remains a sort of hidden text, an unknown text, until the very end of the 19th century, when it's acquired by a sexologist, a German sexologist, who publishes it for the first time in 1904. So then that's when it kind of escapes its sort of prison. It ends up in the hands of Sade's descendants, the Noailles family, and they, because that first edition done by the sexologist is pretty lousy.
It's a translation.
No, it's in French, but you can tell his French is not quite up to the task, and it's also incredibly hard to read because it's a very tiny scrawl. It's it's beautifully and meticulously written, but it's hard to read. You have to sort of almost read it with a magnifying glass. But anyway, a proper version, a proper transcript is done in the 1920s, commissioned by Sade's family. They keep hold of the scroll. They sort of take it out for dinner parties and that kind of thing. And a friend of theirs, I think this is in the 50s or 60s, is a bookseller. He says, "Oh, you should have it valued. I can do that for you." They give him the scroll, and he smuggles it over the border to Switzerland and sells it to a Swiss-German collector of pornography called Johann Nordmann. Decades of legal battles ensue between the two, purported owners of the scroll. So that goes on for many years, and in the sort of 2000s, this slightly dodgy foundation in Paris decides to buy it from this collector for 7 million euros.
Wow.
Which is quite something.
Yeah.
And it turns out that this dodgy foundation is very dodgy indeed, and they go bankrupt. And it's a kind of Ponzi scheme that they've used to raise funds. So it ends up being kind of confiscated by the French government, and eventually bought by the French government, declared a national treasure of all things. It's the most revolting book ever written. It's declared a national treasure. And so it is now in the French National Library. And they've done, for the first time, what was very exciting for me, and for other Sade specialists, is they photographed the whole thing.
Okay. Because
effectively no one had seen it, that scroll, properly, ever, really, So, and it was briefly exhibited by this dodgy foundation in Paris. So I went to see that and took some photos, but it wasn't the whole unfurled thing. It was just kind of a couple of meters of it. But that was only on display for a month or so before the foundation got closed down. So now actually you can see what we didn't have when we were translating is we couldn't see the whole thing. We were relying on this transcript, which actually turns out to have been incredibly accurate. Okay. But yeah, it's quite something to see the real thing. Yeah.
And then you started your translation along with Thomas Wynne was with Penguin in 2016. So how long did that translation take you?
Well, it probably took us 2 or 3 years.
Did you feel for those 2 or 3 years that you were, every day you wake up and you were in the, well, I don't want to say in the chateau, in the castle, but what was that experience like, I guess?
It did feel like that. I mean, I've just written about this for my book, so I've had to sort of go back to Silling, the castle, in the 120 days. It was hard. So there were particular aspects of it which were hard. Some, in terms of the actual kind of mechanics of the translation, it was fairly straightforward. I mean, technically, Sade uses a fairly small vocabulary. The difficulty is how do you translate obscenity? Because obscenity, from one language to another is tricky, sexual slang, all that kind of stuff. It dates very quickly in English, whereas French sexual slang hasn't really changed that much since the 18th century. So So there are sort of technical things to overcome, but once you've decided how you're going to translate a given body part or rude word, that's the task is done. What was difficult about it is there are certain sections of it which I remember being very tough to translate. So much to Sade's critics' dismay, there is a very extended number of a number of the days in 120 Days of Sodom are devoted to coprophilia and coprophagia. So there is a lot of excrement.
Yeah.
Um, and I found those days really hard to get through. So I would sort of start translating at kind of 9 in the morning, and by 10, by 10,
Coprophagia at 9 in the morning is not.
well, yeah, I wanted to get over with, but by 10:30, I was feeling so queasy that I was feeling nauseous, So I would actually have to stop, go out, breathe some fresh air, do something else, and come back to it. And by 12 o'clock, I could not do any more for that particular day. So those passages were really tough, and the other passages that were really tough were to the latter stages of the novel, because the logic of the 120 days is it just gets worse and worse and worse the further you get into it. So it starts off with the simple passions of the kind of perversions.
We should just say briefly that the plot. I don't know if you want to briefly give an overview of the plot for people who know de Sade but haven't.
Sure. So the setup is a bit like a sort of Camphor Tales or a Decameron. Decameron is probably a closer kind of parallel. So what happens is these four noblemen closet themselves away in a castle in the Black Forest for the 120 days in the title, and they bring with them kind of an eclectic group of young boys, young girls, of male studs as they call them, of old women, and cooks and maids and all that kind of stuff. So this whole entourage, and the idea is they lock themselves away in the castle, and they spend their afternoons listening to prostitutes telling the story of their lives with all of these different perversions rolled into them. So every sort of day they hear about 5 different perversions. And it's a kind of monkey see, monkey do logic. So they will hear these stories and then they will enact them. And so the stories these prostitutes tell of their lives, they get increasingly more extreme, increasingly more violent. So the logic of the text is that it escalates in violence all the way through. And in a way, it almost leaves sex behind. It's really more violence than sex, to such an extent that it's almost difficult to know whether you can call it a work of pornography, because pornography tends to imply an intent to arouse, and it might have that effect on a tiny minority of readers, but it's not clear that that's even the intention. So anyway, the violence builds as the days go by, and it ends in this kind of bloodbath. But it's that last section, so it goes from simple passions, then double passions, then criminal passions, and then murderous passions. And the sort of logic, they tell stories of these libertines who go from one perversion and then sort of deteriorate and indulge in even more dangerous passions. And there was just one section where I can still remember exactly where I was when I translated it. It's this sort of series of tortures of sort of pregnant mothers and children. And, that was just, it literally gave me nightmares.
Okay. And was Thomas's experience the same?
I think he was probably better at keeping it at arm's length than me. Okay. I chose to translate that last section because maybe I'm a masochist. Maybe. But I did choose to give him most of the really excremental parts. So
it's interesting that of all the things that's the one that sort of exhausts one's like sensibilities, because of all the things in that novel, I guess that's the one it sounds very strange to say, but that's the one you don't expect to sort of.
Well, I think it's just visceral. So what's quite interesting, the defense of Sade in the 1960s that hollowed about this very influential critic. He was the person in a way that made Sade respectable for literary studies. His defense was he used the phrase "écrit la merde ne sent pas," written down, the word shit does not smell. And I think my experience of translating Sade proved that wasn't true, and that he kind of negates the truth, which is that words have the power to evoke the senses, and that when we read a novel, we conjure up mental images in our heads, and those mental images are not just visual; they're also auditory. They can be tactile, and they can be olfactory. So the excrement inside really does smell, and if you're imagining that as you have to when you're translating it, you can't escape from it. So it becomes just kind of overpowering. But yeah, I think it also affects different readers differently. I had young children at the time, and I think unquestionably that made it harder for me to translate those passages where it's that there's paedophilia in that text, and there's torture of children and pregnant mothers and all that kind of stuff. So I think academic readers and critics like to think of themselves as sort of scientists, as clinicians, as analysts. But that's a bit of a myth too, that the reason why we read fiction is because it has some effect on us and it has some power over us, and you never kind of escape that entirely. And I think in a way to pretend that it doesn't have that kind of visceral power is to do literature a disservice and to be dishonest about your own experiences.
It's interesting that it's almost like you've become a Sadean realist, because the history of 120 Days in terms of its secondary approach, as you've already mentioned, it begins like, this is a sexology document, and then it's an expose on fascism, then it's just a novel, now it's a Penguin classic, and also a national treasure. But you're sort of, you've cut through all that, so well, hang on, here's the shit.
Well, I mean, I think it's just that it is not a realist text in the sense that this is not it's not like the sort of great realist novels of the 19th century.
Oh, I mean realist in the sense that you haven't, it seems your experience you haven't come out the other end of your experience with seeing it as anything like a sexology document or a comment on.
No, well, it's kind of interesting. I mean, everyone has their motives when they're calling him by a particular kind of name. So sexology at the time that they discover Sade was sort of struggling for legitimacy. It's a new discipline, and sexologists have a difficult task because at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, if you're trying to do research into sexual habits and sexual mores, it's not easy because nobody wants to talk about sex. So what effectively happens is, if you look at sort of early, the foundational work of sexology is the Psychopathia Sexualis by Kraft Ebing in 1886, and it's basically a series of case studies. So they rely on case studies of doctors exchanging the case studies of their patients. And it's a little bit like how psychoanalysis starts with Freud and all based on case studies. But the problem that these sexologists have is, as I say, people are reticent, especially in the Victorian age, to talk about these things. So they resort to fiction. So a lot of the kind of case studies come from fictional material. So there is this blurring of fact and reality, and Sade is a great source for them. Of all, and the 120 Days is kind of a list of perversions. So Sade is useful for them. And first of all, they sort of start off talking about Sade as a pathological case, a case of, and that's when sadism becomes a category, along with masochism. But when the 120 Days is published, he stops being the case study. He becomes the kind of doctor. And this sort of myth emerges that 120 Days is this kind of systematic psychopathia sexualis before the one that arrives 100 years later. And that, in a way, is a way of making Sade approachable, a subject for sort of scientific interest. But it's also a way of legitimizing that emerging discipline of sexology, to give it a kind of history. But it's a very risky maneuver because, if you're relying on Sade to make you a respectable discipline, you're on quite shaky ground. And I think the same sort of thing happens throughout the kind of 20th century. So I think what changes over time is that the reasons people find for looking at Sade change. And I think after the concentration camps of the Second World War, people no longer read Sade the same way. It's impossible to read Sade as just a kind of work of fantasy because it no longer seems quite so fantastic. So people like Camus and other French writers like Raymond Queneau, when they hear the accounts coming out of the camps in the wake of the Second World War, they've already read Sartre, but now they read him in a completely different way, and Sartre becomes a kind of precursor of the camps. And there are parallels, in Sartre, the names of the prisoners are all taken away. Every minute of their day is kind of subjected to a really grueling routine. They're told what they can do, when they can go to the toilet, when they can eat, all those sorts of things. Their identities are taken away. They are all dressed in a particular fashion, and they're submitted to tortures. So that dramatically changes the way Sade is read. And I think for the better. I mean, as I was saying to you before we sort of started recording, you have to have a good reason to dive into this kind of world, but one of them, I think, is in a way that Sade provides. He provides a way of thinking about the kind of things that we'd rather not think about for much of our lives. That he reveals to us in a way the sort of darkness of which men are capable, and that, in a way, is also why it's that novel in particular, After 20 Days, but also the other ones. It would be easy to dismiss them as fantasy, but the real world conjures up Sardian examples with sort of depressing regularity. So there is actually very little of the 120 Days that probably hasn't been done in real life. It's just not all in the same place. Every sort of year I teach this stuff, some horrible stories hit the news of a powerful man abusing that power in different ways. The recent examples, there's been Jeffrey Epstein, Sean Diddy Coombs, which is currently in the news now, is a kind of example of that same kind of toxic masculinity, I suppose you'd call it. But also criminal cases like the Josef Fritzl case in the early 2000s. When I hear those stories, you do hear these sort of Sardian themes of not just of the type of power being abused, but often the kind of locations in which that power is wielded, an isolated setting, often these sort of subterranean spaces which are very particular to Sade. The sort of the sort of world of Sade is it's like a dark fairy tale. So there's lots of forests, isolated castles, and these basements and caverns. So there's something sort of strange in a way that the place of absolute freedom for these libertines is also the place of absolute, confinement and imprisonment. And of course, that's probably reflected by the fact that he's writing it in prison.
Yeah. You've mentioned it a couple of times, and it seems like I'm excited, intrigued to hear your answer. Do you think that was Sade's intention then with the book, was to, say, look, this shadow side, this real dark side of humanity is right there, and I'm going to put it right in front of you? Or if that is his intention, is it possibly intertwined with a little bit too much enjoyment on his side for it to just be that? It's because it doesn't come across as a warning, like he's getting off on this, right?
I don't know. I mean, I ought to know by now. I can't figure the guy out, and I've been trying for quite a long time. But you're right. If it had been written by a more respectable person, the setup of the 120 Days, it almost feels like a satire. So you have these four powerful nobles. One of them is a bishop, one of them is a duke, one of them is a banker, and then there's just this sense in which they represent all the authority of Ancien Regime France. So it could be seen as a kind of damning kind of attack on the authorities, the sort of leading authorities, and the other one is a judge, sort of leading authority figures of the 18th century by somebody who's been put in prison, who sees himself as having been persecuted by the authorities. And there is often this kind of feeling in Justine as well, who is also subject to confinement and injustice. There are times where you think, and these figures of authority are also behaving badly, whose side is he on? Is he on the side of the victims? So it's possible, and some critics in the past have read the sensibility of his fiction as being a masochistic one rather than a sadistic one. But I think that gets him off the hook too easily, because there is, as you say, there is this kind of relish, this sort of frenzied sort of relish of violence, which you can't really get away from. But it's really difficult to know what his intentions are. And that goes back to that question I mentioned earlier on, is why on earth did he write the 120 Days? And why did he not finish it? And it's difficult to know who he was writing it for. So it's possible he was just writing it for himself. So, in other words, he was his own intended reader. But I suspect he intended to publish it, but then he probably got to the end of that part which he finished, and he stops there, I think, because he probably knows that the rest of it is not publishable that time. But this is 1785. This is before the revolution. It would not have been publishable, even illegally. That said, some of the things that he did publish in the 1790s, like Juliette and the Nouvelle Justine, the sort of the long, extreme version of Justine, the content in there is just as bad as the 120 Days. It's just less systematic. So it was publishable a decade later. But I mean, if he had finished it, it would have gone from being 500 pages long to 2,000. So as a translator, I'm delighted that he didn't.
Kind of positive, and not in the sense of optimistic, but a worldview that actually can be sculpted, that we could call Sadean, be retrieved from these texts. Because it's interesting, earlier you mentioned in terms of the biography, when the revolution is happening, it seems with regard to Sade's biography that he turns on a dime with respect to whatever and whoever can get him out of trouble or help him, or like he doesn't really have any principles in those terms. Like moves from, I think, from the monarchy and then to a republican, etc. And so in terms of his philosophy, is it sort of an active libertine nihilism? Is that what we can define Sadean as?
Well, he's a bit of a magpie philosophically, but he's a survivor. So he begins his life in incredibly privileged circumstances. He's born in the household of a prince, in a sort of royal household in Paris, and he's banished from there at 4 years old because he beats up the prince in question, and is sort of banished to the south of France to be raised by his uncle for a while. But he is incredibly proud of his aristocratic roots. So, I mean, he's a feudalist, really. So this kind of idea of Sade as the great libertarian, he is very much an aristocrat, to his core. And he comes from an incredibly old and noble aristocratic family, and he's very proud of that. But come the revolution, he has to survive. And so he actually takes an active role in revolutionary politics, becomes the head of one of the revolutionary kind of sections in Paris. Is ironically not seen as revolutionary enough and radical enough, and ends up in prison during the terror, and is scheduled for execution. He's still sentenced to execution. And the story goes, this is probably another myth, but the story goes that so he's waiting to be executed in this prison, and they call out the names of all those to be executed, and he doesn't answer when they call out his name, and gets away with it. I mean, it feels like, it's brilliant advice. Is if anyone calls your name in order to be executed, don't answer. But it seems unlikely to me. But I suspect somebody was paid off. And he's saved by the fact that Robespierre is executed the next day, and so the reason for the killing Sade is also gone. So he has sort of close scrapes. But as a survivor, he has to repress his aristocratic identity. Otherwise, he'll be joining the many victims. So he has to change in that regard. But I think I would say of his philosophy is that he's a reader. I mean, he spends a lot of his time in prison reading sort of materialist philosophy of various, French thinkers at the time. So if I were to sort of define his philosophy, I would say it was sort of atheistic materialism. But it's a very bleak. I wouldn't say he was a nihilist. I would say he has a kind of affinity with a philosopher that he would not have read, and that because he was a British philosopher, and that's Hobbes. So that kind of very bleak worldview of sort of man's lives being sort of nasty, brutish, and short, very much chimes with the kind of a pessimistic view of the world. So Sade is a convinced atheist and a convinced materialist. And so when you take on those beliefs, Sade's the kind of dark extension of that line of argument, which is if there is no supernatural, if there's no spirit, then all you have is your body. And all that matters is what the body feels. Good and evil disappear as kind of phantoms and fantasies. So in a way, the focus on the body in Sade makes sense because it's kind of expression of the philosophy. And for Sade and Sade's libertines, what they are striving for is sensations, stimulation. And the stronger the sensations, the better. And that, in a way, it sounds like an excuse, but it's more than that. That is, in a way, why there is such a focus on sex and on the pornographic, but also on violence. Because Sade's libertines, he goes into sort of physiological details that he argues that the act of violence creates a kind of frisson, a kind of sensations, a sort of vibration in the body, which is more powerful than any other. And for Sade, pain is more powerful than pleasure. So pleasure is not enough for Sade's libertines. And the greatest sort of pleasure they feel is when they're inflicting pain. Because that produces the sort of most visceral reaction on them. So that, in a way, so it's a very sort of dark vision of humanity. And the kind of, the blind spot of Sade, in a way, is that he only sees the darkness of humanity. The idea that that pleasurable sensations are possible without violence seems to sort of escape him. So it's a fairly bleak sort of vision of mankind and of nature in a way. He sees nature as a kind of destructive force. And in a way, by committing acts of violence, his liberties are just doing what nature dictates. And there is a kind of sort of Darwinism before Darwin as well. I mean, one of the libertines in Justine says that selfishness is the first law of nature. Because all you have is your body. So other bodies don't matter. And it's also really about survival of the fittest. It is the world of Sade is kind of the law of the jungle.
Yeah.
And that is in a way why women are the kind of perpetual victims in Sade. They're seen as the weaker sex, and therefore, are vulnerable to the crimes committed by men.
So what's the end point of that? It seems as if he's reduced to material. You just keep searching pleasures and pain until you die.
Well, yeah, I mean, but that's the interesting thing. He ends up in these sort of cycles of violence. All of his works do, and the case of Justine is an interesting one because he can't let that story go. So he writes it for the first time in prison in 1787. It's short. It's like a kind of Voltaire story. It's quite respectable. It's sort of 100 pages or so. And then when he leaves prison, he publishes it in 1791 in longer version. He spices it up, as he says to his lawyer, to get more readers. And that's like 200 or 300 pages long. And that has some success. But then he produces a third version, sort of a few years later, which is like 600 or 700 pages or 900 pages even. No one's ever translated it because it's so long. And it's just every telling gets more and more extreme, more and more excessive, more and more violent. And it's just this sort of onslaught. But he's sort of in this sort of doom loop of retelling the same story again and again and again. But in terms of his sort of worldview, his libertines sort of fantasize that, because one of the objections that they allow sort of prisoners to object to the philosophical argument. So the structure of a Sade novel is you have philosophical dialogue, violence or sex, philosophical dialogue. So in the philosophical dialogues, some of the victims are complaining like, well, with all this violence, if you kill all the women, what will you do then? And the answer is, well, nature will find a way. There are probably ways that men were born before women existed. Nature will find some alternative. So the propagation of the species is not a kind of winning argument in Sade for putting an end to the violence. And there's also this every kind of, you see it. I mean, what you were talking about is true. You see this thirst for ever greater crimes in Sade. And there's a really striking moment in the 120 Days of Sodom where one of the libertines sort of bemoans the fact that they're just not satisfied with these petty crimes anymore, that they'd like to do something really big. And one of them says, I want to attack the sun. Which is a great line. But it's like slightly, if you could do it, slightly counterproductive to your own existence, but they don't really care. But there is just that ambition to wield power. I suppose you could say an ambition to wield power from somebody who must have felt utterly powerless, prisoner in the bestie. So if there are fantasies inside, you could argue they are kind of fantasies of power from somebody who is effectively kind of impotent. And what's telling about the four libertines actually in the 120 Days is 2 or 3 of them are basically impotent. They're not sexy, glamorous figures.
No.
Which is also interesting. He doesn't try to make them appealing. Libertines are quite glamorous figures in the novels of other writers, but his libertines are grotesque and repulsive, which is probably complicated by the fact often in Sade, the grotesque and the repulsive is what they are drawn to. So they have beautiful young boys and girls, but they sort of choose to have sex with sort of old crones with no teeth and sort of cankers on their bodies, and so there is a kind of, they are drawn to the grotesque as well. So it's a sort of flipping over of standard, norms.
Do you see that possibly as Sade sort of critiquing his own worldview? He doesn't want it to be too pure.
I think it probably goes back to that thirst for sensation and for shocking. Whether it's shocking his readers or even sort of shocking himself, that the most powerful sensations are the most shocking, so and they're therefore the most transgressive. So, so having sex with a beautiful woman is just a norm. That's what that culture prizes. So he's much more interested in something that challenges that norm. So that might be sex with an old woman or with a man. And the kind of sex he would favour happens to be, as 120 Days of Sodom, the title tells you, it's a novel that is interested in transgressive sex. So the only sex that you don't get in 120 Days of Sodom is sort of vanilla sex. So he's interested in whatever breaks the norm. And because it breaks the norm, that's the most erotic for him. And the reason why sodomy is the most erotic to him is it breaks not only the law, but it also violates religious norms as well. So there is a very kind of intensive anti-Catholic sort of thrust in all of his works. He's writing against the Catholic Church in a lot of what he's doing.
So, with all of this said, it's interesting that one of the sort of maybe not the final, because you've got, as you already mentioned, Roland Barthes, but Simone de Beauvoir is one of the first to offer a feminist reading. So that's there historically, but it just brings me to the broader question of: is there anything redeemable in Sade? Is it? I mean, that seems to be one of the places where something has been brought out of it that is liberatory, is emancipative. But I haven't read it myself, so I'm not sure on the feminist.
So there is. So it starts off. So that kind of there was sort of argument that Sade is a proto-feminist that starts right at the turn of the 20th century. A French poet called Guillaume Apollinaire publishes what he calls selected pages of Sade. So you can guess the pages he doesn't choose. Uh, and he writes a quite long preface to that in which he says that Sade was really on the side of women. And he sort of talks about these two sisters, Justine and Juliette. So Justine is the virtuous good girl, the Catholic, and Juliette is her sister who takes the opposite course. She becomes a libertine. She commits infanticide, kills her husband. She commits every kind of atrocity possible and is rewarded at every stage. So you have virtue rewarded on one side, virtue punished on one side and vice rewarded. And he says that what Sade is doing by showing you these two figures is Justine is the woman of the past, enslaved by religious, moral values, cultural values. And he says, Juliette is the woman of the future who will sort of take off and sprout wings, this kind of liberated woman. And he said that Sade is he calls Sade the freest spirit that ever lived. So that's where that kind of libertarian myth comes from a bit. And says that Sade wanted women to be as free as he was, which was not free, obviously. But yeah, so I think so that argument is made. You also have to remember, is in the first half of the 20th century, hardly anyone could actually read Sade because he was published in limited editions, circulating like 200 or 300 copies, mostly bought up by medical faculties or by extremely wealthy men, sort of bourgeois, doctors and lawyers, and people who were deemed safe to read Sade. But when Simone de Beauvoir reads Sade, she's interesting, and she says she argues that the value of Sade is that he disturbs us, and I have a lot of sympathy for that view. And she's also writing, in the wake of the Second World War. And she sees Sade as sort of being a good starting point for thinking about ethics and about the way we relate to each other as human beings, about what that relationship is. But it's not really particularly feminine. It doesn't really tackle the question of women. But that happens later on. So in the 70s, with the rise of second wave feminism, in America, but also in England, feminists start to take a real interest in Sade. And that's because Sade becomes a kind of counterculture classic in the 60s in America, selling in the hundreds of thousands. The Grove Press in New York published him alongside other kind of avant-garde writers, and he's a huge hit on kind of American campuses. So he became, so although he's long dead by that time, he's sort of brought back to life in the public imagination. And he becomes a kind of key sort of totemic figure in the debate about pornography at that time, in the so-called sex wars. And the slogan of the kind of campaign against pornography at the time, the slogan championed by Robin Morgan is that pornography is the theory, rape is the practice. And Sade is described as Andrea Dworkin as being the world's most foremost pornographer. And she uses the present tense as if he was sort of still around. So in a way, all pornography is tarred with the same brush, and all pornography is seen as misogynistic and violent, and all pornography is seen as heterosexual. So there's lots of kind of weaknesses in the argument, but that's the argument that's made. Angela Carter makes a counter argument. So Angela Carter is a really interesting writer in all sorts of ways, and a very different kind of feminist. And Sade sort of splits feminism, so there you have feminists falling against Sade. But Carter's stories in The Bloody Chamber are very much influenced by Sade. There's a Marquis in the stories. And she writes a book called The Sadean Woman, in which she argues that Sade is on the side of women in the sense that he's the first writer to acknowledge female sexuality and female agency, and to allow women to have desires. So she sort of defends Sade and is, much to Andrea Dworkin's horror, she sort of an argumentative series where she sort of castigates Carter for being on the wrong side. And there are limits to Carter's argument because Sade does allow women sexual drives of their own, and there are some powerful women in Sade like Juliet, but there is always within male limits. So even a woman as powerful as Juliet still has to submit to male authority. And there's one point in Juliet where she hesitates when she is told to commit a particular crime by one of the male libertines. And she is seen to hesitate by that male libertine and then has to scarp her and has to run away in fear of her life because she has wavered in executing an order. But a really interesting critic, I must mention, is Jane Gallup. So Jane Gallup is an American academic who did her doctorate on Sade and Bataille and others, and was a great admirer of Sade. And so she is on the opposite side of Andrea Dawkins. She was a sex-positive feminist who was very much against this campaign against pornography. And she spoke in very honest terms about the fact that she found Sade erotic and that she, read him as a young woman and found it very liberating. But what's interesting about her is that she comes back to reading Sade 20 years later, and she reads Philosophy in the Boudoir, which is like the fun Sade text in a way. It sort of ends in violence, but it's unusual for a Sade text because everyone's having consensual sex. So there's no acts of violence until the end. And Jane Gallup sort of looks back on her younger self and the sort of the eroticism she found in it. But when she comes back to it 20 years later, having had a child, she sort of reads it in horror and in kind of despair at her younger self, because she realizes that her kind of enjoyment with it as a young woman was complicit with the misogyny that is at the heart of the text, and that it is fundamentally a mother-hating text. So she felt complicit with that kind of misogyny and complicit with its sort of objectification of women. So there are, everyone can find what they want inside. That's been one of the kinds of traits of his. But for me, if there's something redemptive in Sade, I think is that if you read Sade constructively and productively, he is a good way to engage with that sort of dark side of human nature. And he's a good sort of starting point for thinking about things like ethics, things about the propensity to violence, things about, questions of sexuality and all those sorts of things. So he's an interesting starting point to think about the sort of things that we tend not to think about. And I think that's what I found with students. So, and what I'm struck by is that, if you wanted to convert someone to feminism, you could do worse than give them a copy of Sade. So rather than kind of corrupting readers and turning them all into misogynists, I think there is such sort of shock in Sade, and there is something so repulsive about Sade that there's a sort of sense in which it can sort of shock you into virtue, and it can make you think about things, because it's all sort of turned up to 11 in Sade. Misogyny of more respectable culture is kind of exposed by Sade. So he kind of sort of shines a spotlight on more subtle forms of sort of misogyny and and violence that we see in the world today.
What do you think he would make of his popularity, make of being a Penguin classic?
He'd love it. He would be absolutely delighted, which is one of the things that I felt kind of a big grudge to me. I was like, God, I'm making him respectable, aren't I? His great ambition was to be a respectable man of letters. He wanted that kind of, and he published short stories which are very good and they're not. His short stories are fairly respectable. They're sort of dark, kind of gothic tales, but they're probably his best writing. There's a collection called The Crimes of Love, which he published in 1800. And at that point, he absolutely did want to be a sort of respectable man of letters, subversive under the surface, but respectable. So he would be absolutely delighted, being kind of canonized as a literary author, because he wanted respectability. But as I sort of said I sort of said a couple of times in like the preface to 120 Days, the fact that he can be literary in a way shows how the definition of literature has changed. And for Sade to become literary, there has to have been a kind of change in attitudes about the power of fiction to do any harm. Because if Sade becomes a Penguin Classics, it means that Penguin is no longer worried about a book being banned, and no longer worried about a kind of uproar about the corrupting power of a work of fiction. So it implies in a way that we consider literature as safe in a way that we don't, for example, with cinema at times, or with pornography, and or with propaganda. And I kind of question that sort of special treatment for literature. But I think there was also something interesting about the fact that, Sade becoming a classic changes the way probably people read Sade. I think it also changes the definition of a classic too. So I think, literature becomes a bit more Sardian, as well as Sade becoming a bit more literary, when Sade becomes a Penguin classic. And he gains a sort of form of respectability on the one hand. But you could also argue that literature becomes a bit more dangerous if Sade is in the club.
But it also has its limit, because I wonder to where do we go with transgression from Sade? Have we, anything? There's a couple that spring to mind, but when you read them, you think it's almost like how a fantasy writer might say, well, you're kind of copying Tolkien. That seems a bit cheap, but in terms of transgression, it's all there. It almost makes one wonder what transgression is now after 120 days.
Well, yes, and when you think, well, I suppose the transgressions he had in mind are obviously those of his day. Mm-hmm. The ones he chooses have particular targets, and as I said, related to kind of the Catholic Church and the values of the time, the morality of the time, and the belief in God. So in a way, if you were thinking about what the great transgressions would be today, you'd have to think about, well, what are the dominant values today? I think it's probably more complicated now because we're so polarized. Mm-hmm. That, a lot of what circulates on the far right feels very transgressive for those not from the far right. And I'm sure people on the far right see a lot of, and have seen a lot of, what's happening in terms of progressive politics over the last sort of 30, 40 years as being transgressive and transgressing their values. So that so in the culture wars, nothing is quite as simple because there is not that sort of same kind of pyramid of authority and of monarchy at the top setting the rules. That there at that time it was much clearer what the transgressions could be. Now we're not really clear anymore what the rules are. So it's more difficult to say, and probably more difficult for someone to be truly transgressive. So there is a kind of interesting. There's an interesting progression in the sense that the kind of trend, my students sort of tend to assume that the trend over time is that society has become progressively more liberal. Mm-hmm. But as I sort of suggest to them, in a way, it could be more than a cycle than a sort of steady line. That while a lot of things seem to have been progressive since the 19th century in relation to sex and all those sorts of things, you can argue the 18th century is more progressive than the 19th. The 19th, so you have periods of progression and then repression. So there's certainly the kind of what felt like a sort of inexorable progressive turn away from censorship and for some more liberal values in sort of Western democracies no longer seems quite so clear anymore. Mm-hmm. Backlashes seem to be possible.
So just a couple of kind of final questions, just on your book that soon will be released. You tell me you just sent it off. Sensing Fictional Violence, Reading with the Marquis de Sade. What was some of the most, there's reactions that I guess you would assume, okay, like revulsion and not really wanting to engage because it's so disgusting. But was there any reactions to reading Sade that really surprised you? My own, by the way, from my first reading 120 Days of Sodom was exhaustion. You mentioned that end point of bang, bang, bang. And I remember just thinking, like, I've got like 100 pages left. I am exhausted. Any say sense connections that are there earlier just get ground down to this sort of weird, dark, utilitarian pulp of like, I've got to get through this.
Yeah, no, it's an ordeal. It's an endurance. It's quite interesting because one of the things that's very striking, and I kind of argue against, is that Uh, those sort of critics in the sort of 80s, 90s, even today, who kind of helped to rehabilitate Sade as a subject of literary study, they're very keen to say that Sade is boring, which is odd considering that they're the ones trying to make him kind of respectable. But what effectively I think that's code for is, I don't get off on this honest gov, you know. So there's a kind of desire to maintain your own purity. But boring is the wrong word. And I sort of say to my students, if you find this boring, you're not reading it right. Because I think there's something disturbing about finding violence boring.
Yeah.
But I think your way is a much better word, is that there is something draining and exhausting about it. There's a relentlessness about it. And that can probably feel like boredom after a while. But I think that's a kind of defense mechanism too, that, how do you get through a novel like The 120 Days? One of the ways is to kind of engage with it. And that can be kind of a full-on sensory experience, but quite an ordeal. So there's a natural kind of tendency to sort of step back, to pull back and remind yourself, this isn't real, and to sort of keep your distance. And that's a kind of defense mechanism. But in terms of the reactions, it's interesting. That's one of the things that's informed my book is the teaching of Sade. So I teach it every year to a group of sort of 20 or 30 students or so. So I hear what they make of Sade. And I've got them to fill out questionnaires about their sort of sensory responses to particular passages as well. And that's been a kind of the heart of the book, rather than just rely on my own introspection. And it was striking that last time I taught it, last autumn, we had an optional class on the 120 days. And I asked them which bit did they think was the worst. At which point did they think, wow, they couldn't go on. And one student said, exactly the same bit that I found the worst in the whole thing. And it was at the end of that section of Tortures of Pregnant Mothers, where one of the victims in the castle is then kind of torn apart by these liberties. And I remember at the time of translating it, that was the point where I was like, I'm done with this. And so there's that kind of, so it was striking that I wasn't the only person that had that same experience. Just like that was the culmination of the violence. And afterwards, and I said, did you carry on afterwards? She's like, oh yeah, you thought I got this far. And but afterwards, actually, it's a kind of anticlimax that the violence doesn't manage to hit that horrible height. But yeah, there was some, and I made myself masochistically again go back to retranslate that passage for the writing of my book, because I wanted to. Because what was interesting was after having that class, I was writing a chapter on what it was like to translate Sade. So I reread our translation for the first time since we published it. And that was at the same point where I stopped again. I was like, I'm skipping that one. I thought, so that's the one I'll make myself translate. But reactions are very unpredictable. I've only ever had a student cry in my class once. This was many years ago, and this was philosophy in the boudoir. And I was just starting the class, and I noticed this student in tears, and I was like, what happened? What's wrong? So anyway, we started talking about it. And I was like, she's like, it's so awful. I couldn't believe it. I'm like, well, which bit? What was it? And she's like, on page 102, one of the libertines invokes Lucifer and blasphemes against, and she's like, why would he do that? And I was like, okay. So the first 100 pages of misogyny and sex, that was fine. And then she was sort of berated. So it turned out that she was quite a devout Christian student. And then what was quite striking was that sat next to her was a very devout Muslim student who said to her, Will told us. He gave us a warning at the start of the course. So I do give lots of warnings at the start. And readers not to do this, to read this stuff. Which are, of course, also the reasons why they should do this stuff. So I do give lots of warnings. But there was I closed down the argument because it was not going to be productive. But it was a really valuable lesson in the unpredictability of responses. And did people bring their own kind of cultural sensitivity? Just in the same way, I probably responded more than my co-translator to the scenes with children in than he did. He may well have felt other aspects of the text were the ones that really hit home with him.
Yeah. It's interesting though. I mean, Desade's still managing to get his Christian transgressions in there
Yep.
many years after. Is there anything you'd like to add about de Sade or his work that you feel is key, or you often don't get to talk about?
No, I think that's fine. I think we covered a lot of ground.
So Sensing Fictional Violence, that's probably going to be released next year or so, I'd assume.
Either later this year or next year. It will be free.
Oh,
So I'm publishing it open access, so people will be able to read it online. If they want a hard copy, then they have to pay for it. But yeah, I wanted it to be. The problem with academic books is they're so expensive.
Yeah.
So I wanted this one I wanted my students and others to be able to access this stuff for free. So yeah, that is going to be called Sensing Violence: Reading with the Marquis de Sade.
Are you taking a break now, or have you planned another de Sade book?
I think I'm done with Sade. I mean, it goes back to that point: is you have to have a point. There has to be a point to reading Sade. And my point was, in a way, to try to figure out what I thought about this stuff and whether it is justifiable to read it, let alone teach it. And so it's taken me about 10 years to really kind of, figure out what I thought. I think now that I've done so, I should probably sort of leave it behind and do something nice and fluffy.
Yeah, that sounds nice. Well, I'll be sure to put the links for both of your translations in the description below. But, well, McMorran, that's been a great conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.